Well, the earthquake that is Brexit continues to rumble. Will there be a redo? What happens to Scotland? What about the markets? All perfect turning point questions. Janice Stein is a founding director of the Monk School of Global Affairs. Mel Kapp is a former Canadian High Commissioner to the United Kingdom. And Samantha Nutt is the founder of War Child Canada. So let's get first to some very basics. Is the vote binding?
There are many ways to unbind, Peter. There will be a new prime minister. There could be a snap election, and the election may be fought over this. And the result is uncertain. And the big issue of Scotland, constitutionally, since power has been devolved, do you need the consent of the constituent parts? I can imagine 3 or 4 ways you can unravel this.
All right, we'll get to Scotland in a minute. On the basic question of binding in terms of the vote, Mel?
Well, Peter, there is an act of parliament that brought Britain into the European Union. You can't just have the Prime Minister say, well, sorry, we're out. You actually have to engage Parliament. Parliament will have to vote and change legislation. So this could go for quite a while. And which leader is going to bring that to Parliament and manage the vote in Parliament? This could be quite a continuing uncertainty for some time.
You know, we've seen over the course of the last few days upwards of 4 million Brits saying, hey, you know, I didn't really understand it. I want to vote again. Is a redo on the vote possible, Sam?
Well, I think, unfortunately, there aren't any do-overs in a democracy just because you disagree with the outcome. And while I agree that certainly it now has to go to Parliament and some decisions have to be made and there's the whole exit strategy has to be fully negotiated, I think to turn back the tide on that is next to impossible. I mean, politically, practically, it will just fuel that sense of division that already exists within the country and those resentments as well. And I think that's I think the idea of having another vote after this, hopefully after the outcome of this last referendum, people will be quite nervous about that.
You know, what we've also witnessed in at least the 2 business days since the vote is the markets in total turmoil, not just, you know, in Britain, but here in North America as well and elsewhere in the world. What has to happen for the markets to stabilize? No?
Well, Peter, the degree of uncertainty of where this is going, just as we've been having this conversation, is being factored into the markets, and that's reflected as volatility. The markets won't settle until things become clear. That
could be ages.
It could be ages. I mean, we could be for a decade if things play out in one scenario or other. But certainly for the course of the next few months, we're going to have a prime minister who's a lame duck. We're going to have a parliament where 2 leaders have their credibility under threat. And you have the integrity of the United Kingdom being questioned, as you've just questioned it. All of this uncertainty says, well, where's the investment money going to go? How are markets going to respond? And it's still up in the air, and it will be for a while. This isn't going to settle soon.
Let me talk about the Scotland issue. You raised it a little bit, Janice, but, you know, for Scotland, which was, what, 65%, almost 65% in the Remain camp, right. They're now saying, hey, this ain't us. Right. We're not interested in pulling out. We want to stay in. Is there a way for them to stay in while the rest of the UK, which would no longer be the UK, pulls out?
Well, one way they could do this, Peter, is to block the exit strategy by saying they have a constitutional veto. But short of that, no. The best that England could get in these negotiations is to join the European Economic Area, which is what Norway is in right now. And to put it in a nutshell, they would have to do everything that the Leave people don't want them to do in order to remain a member of this open market. So they have to agree to labor mobility. They don't want that. They'd have to agree to the regulations of Brussels. They don't want that.
Labor mobility was one of the whole reasons that the deal seemed to go south.
Funnily enough, Scotland would have to have a tariff barrier with England. That's not going to happen. So if this actually moves forward, but I agree, this is a long process, and I know there are no do-overs, but there are do-arounds, which is really what I expect. Scotland will not be able, will have to leave.
Any disagreement on that?
I do. I think it remains to be seen in terms of what's going to happen next with Scotland. They can negotiate a different kind of status, maybe one that hasn't been defined previously. There are examples of having that kind of relationship, Greenland being one of them, that did leave the European Union over fishing tariffs and was able to negotiate a different kind of relationship. So the next few weeks and months, maybe there's a formula that hasn't even been thought of yet, and certainly I would suspect that's what England is hoping for, to keep the United Kingdom together.
Two things, though. I mean, first of all, remember the 62% of the population of Scotland that voted to remain. Not all of them were independentists. Some of them were dyed-in-the-wool England types or British types, and we've got to remember that. The real problem is not Scotland. I think the real problem is Northern Ireland. 55% of Northern Ireland voted to remain, and again, Protestants and Catholics both did. But right now, since the Good Friday Agreement, there is no border. And as of the time that the UK pulls out of Europe, there's a land border with Europe between the United Kingdom and Europe, and it's at the Republic of Ireland. And you're going to have to put in place all of the infrastructure to manage a land border and to split families who now are totally integrated across the border. That's going to be tough.
If Britain leaves, all of Britain leaves, can the EU survive? Sam?
I think the EU can survive. It's going to be difficult. Britain was the #2 contributor to the EU financially, so that's going to be a major issue. I think the bigger question here is, will Britain survive without the European Union? And, you know, certainly its influence will decline in the world. It will really impede European businesses. We're already seeing the economic effects. And so I think Britain has more to lose in this equation than the European Union does.
No?
Well, I think this is like Britain pulled the pin on the grenade and rolled it across the channel. And, you know, we don't really know what the consequences are. We've unleashed forces that are going to be at work on the continent that will be very divisive. And so there are independentist movements in Netherlands, in Germany, in France, in Spain. And you have the subnational independence movements like Catalonia and the Basque region. So really, we don't know where this is going to end up. And I've just talked about the Western Europeans. The Eastern Europeans versus the Western Europeans is going to be another tension.
Janice, if it does start to implode on the European side, who goes first?
Well, you know, the Netherlands, the right-wing party in the Netherlands has already asked for a referendum here. But one country that nobody's talking about here is Greece. There are still very tough financial negotiations. Greece is not able to pay the interest on its debt. And this time, Greek voters may follow the example.
How many times have we heard that?
That's right. But this time it may be for real, given what the Brits have just done.
What's the immediate impact on Canada through this? I mean, we tend to, obviously, when we look at the markets, it seems negative, a lot of concern. But is there an upside in all this possible? No?
Well, I wish there was. I'm not convinced there is, really. In some respects, Canadians are big investors in Britain, and Britons are big investors in Canada. That'll sort of continue. But for new investment, people who want, you know, you get to choose 60 million market, 440 million market. Which one would you like to invest in? Investing in a car parts plant in Britain and having to pay 10% duty to get to France and Germany, not such a good idea.
Sam?
If I was forced to find an upside, if I had to sort of dig around to find one, you might be able to make the case that you've got Obama and Clinton, for example, who have been not enthusiastic supporters of NAFTA, so it is possible that they will look at the economic fallout that the UK is now facing, and maybe it might make them second-guess some of the rhetoric and the rancor around that. That would be a positive development for Canada, but it's hard to say, I think, at this moment in time.
Spook them.
It might spook them. Yeah, it might make them think, okay, you know, some of this, we need to tone this down a little bit because the fallout for us could be much more significant than we were anticipating.
A lot of talk in these last few days, in fact, in these last few months, when we've witnessed what's been going on in other countries as well, about the politics of exclusion. What did this teach us about that?
Well, first of all, you know, they're very dangerous. This is really, as Mal said, playing with fire, playing with grenades, and it takes you to very unexpected places. But I think a really important lesson, Peter, that people are not talking about is we have to listen to the people who feel excluded and are angry even when we don't agree with the message. One of the things we know from exit polls is that what pushed people over into that leave camp in those last 36 hours was calling them racist. So we have to be very, very careful with the language that we use to talk to people that we don't agree with. That's true in Canada, too.
Sam?
One of the things that has been most interesting about this as well is that you've got, I mean, initially this started as a rift with the Conservative Party, but then it also managed to be able to unite the fringe forces on the left as well, those anti-globalization, anti-corporatization movements. And the ways in which, for me, what's most concerning is the ways in which those political leaders were able to divide those opinions, to manipulate, to verge on demagoguery in order to achieve that agenda. And the number of people who came on board for that and subscribed to that, and then even had regrets the very next day. You know, it was passion that was driving it more than anything else. And when you look at what's happening across Europe and the rise and strength of those nationalistic movements, I think that's a very, very dangerous kind of equation. And I'm very concerned in terms of what it means. It's the kind of populism and demagoguery that over time has had disastrous outcomes for many civilians around the world. So we'll see what happens.
Mel.
3 quick points. The first is I totally agree with Sam's point about anti-globalization. This is going back to Little England, Britain trying to withdraw from the world. We are now so interdependent. Globalization is here and it's here to stay. You can't insulate yourself from the world, and that's what this is an attempt to do. The second point is I think there is a special place in hell for leaders who put the existential future of their country at risk, and that's what's happened in this case. And no
You really don't like referendums, do you?
Well, that was my third point, Peter. It's anti-democratic. We have...
How can it be anti-democratic when you let everybody have a vote?
Because we have representative democracy for a reason. We decide not to have referendums for a good reason. These are bloody complicated issues. We don't want the public, and the public doesn't want, to actually take responsibility, as we're seeing the remorse after the vote.
But 35 million people voted.
Well, but they want people, they want their representatives, I think, to deal with the complexity of this. We've just talked about how complex this is. I don't think the public at large really wants to bite this nut and crack their teeth.
I think Mel's right, Peter, because one of the differences between a referendum and Parliament, it protects minorities. Parliaments protect minorities. Referendum don't.
But this sounds elitist, if you don't mind.
Four of us, not
No, but when you say...
Exactly the attitude that sort of spurred some of this in the first place is the people turn around saying, you don't get to tell us what we believe in and what we think is right or wrong, right?
Yeah, but that's why we have protections for minorities, and referendums don't do that, right? And they actually divide. They take complex problems, they say yes or no.
Simple.
They inflame passions. They're actually a very dangerous tool. I'm glad we don't do more of them in Canada. We had one. That was enough for 2.
Well, yeah, in fact, when you think back,
wow.
You know, as I think a lot of people have been doing these last few days, is how close that 95 referendum was, the chaos that we might have been in the following days. All right, listen, great discussion. I think we should do another one just on referenda at some point, but we'll get some ones in here to beat you up on that front. Thanks, Mel. Great of you to join us. Sam and Janice, as always.